Hi there, so glad you could join us for our live today on our Hoop Sisters Pincushions. This is Linda from Hoop Sisters, of course, and today I'm going to show you our Dresden plate pincushion design. So this is the large pincushion that I'm holding. It's got a great little flange so you can put your clips on it. It's got a wonderful large pincushion area. It's just really cute with our Dresden plate. And of course we have the matching wrist pincushion, which I love. It's got an elastic band. You can make it fit you perfectly. Again, it's got the flange for the clips, plus a pincushion, and we've even inserted a piece of plastic at the bottom of it so the pin doesn't go through to your arm. These are available on a USB, or of course you can download. The USB will have all your designs and all your formats, as well as the download. If you're purchasing it in your quilt shop and you need to buy some supplies, we've very nicely listed about what you need. A lot of this can be done with scraps out of your stash. So let's get started. I'm going to, this video will be on the two pincushions, and we'll go back and forth from stitching the fronts and how to put them together. Can't wait to show you. So let's walk through what we need to make our large pincushion. I've printed out the instructions, and as we flip through them, we'll see there's an image of our computerized embroidery file. Our pincushion file is 5 inches by 5 inches. This is the important page. This gives us all of our supplies that we need. So first of all, I started with my battleizer. I've got that hooped up and ready to go. We're just going to need one hooping of battleizer for this project. I've got my background fabric. Actually, this is my background fabric. This is the one the Dresden will be stitched on. I've got a bigger piece of backing fabric. I've got my 4 little flanges, and these are the flanges that the clips can attach to. You need 12 different blades for your Dresden. I chose 6 red fabrics, and I'm going to do 2 each. So here are my Dresden blades. Great scrap buster. I just went through all my scraps this morning and found all these beautiful little red prints. Then I've chose a black for my center. We will also need a scrap of 5-inch square upholstery foam, which I happen to have. It's 5 by 5 by 1. If you don't have that, you can go ahead and use maybe some hoop shape that you have and just cut enough squares, 5 inches square. And I think I have 2, 4, 6. You could do 5 or 6 and it'll make plenty of thickness. We use that so that the bottom of our pincushion sits flat on the table. If we just stuff it with fiber fill, which you also need, you're going to need a couple of handfuls of fiber fill. If we just stuff it with the fiber fill, it won't sit flat on the table. You could even use, if you don't have the upholstery foam, use something like a piece of cardboard or something like that. We'll need some wash away thread. We'll need some embroidery bobbin thread, and then a couple of embroidery threads to do your stitching. So we got a red to match this, and we got a black to match the center. So I think we're ready to get started with some preparation. So some prep work we have to do before we get started with the embroidery. These are my flange pieces. I've gone ahead and taken all 4 of them to the ironing board, and I've pressed under the short edges 1/4 inch, and then I've pressed them in half. So we're going to do that to all 4, and we're going to set these aside. And then we have our backing fabric. This is our larger piece that's 8 inches square, and you're supposed to go ahead and mark out a box in each corner that's 1.5 inches square. So I just took my ruler and I put it at 1.5 inches, and I used, in my case, I have a red friction pen. So I did that in all 4 corners, and then I marked a little line 1/4 inch up because we're going to start stitching there. So each corner has 1.5 inch box with a 1/4 inch mark for your stitching. The next step is to take this to the sewing machine. I'm going to fold it in half diagonally, right sides together. This will be like a 2-step process. So I will start stitching at that 1/4 inch mark all the way to the corner at this edge and at the opposite edge. I'll start stitching from the 1/4 inch mark all the way to the fold. Then we'll take it apart, or not take it apart, we'll unfold it, refold it, and we'll do the same thing to the opposite side. We'll start at that 1/4 inch mark, stitch to the fold, do a little back stitch there to make sure it doesn't come out as well as the beginning, and we'll do the same thing here. Start at the 1/4 inch, little back stitch, to the fold, little back stitch, and then we're going to trim these, but we'll come back when I get that stitched up and we'll show you how to trim them. I've decided to go ahead and prep for my wrist pincushion at the same time I'm going to do my large one because the steps are very similar. So we'll start by doing our little tiny flanges, and they're done the same way. The raw edges on the short ends are pressed under a 1/4 inch. Then you press them in half, and we have 4 of these, and we'll set them aside. Then we have a larger piece, and this piece on the longer ends gets pressed under a 1/4 inch twice. We're going to top stitch this, and we'll set that aside. And then we have pretty much the same thing on the bottom of the wrist pincushion as we do on the regular pincushion. These are marked off an inch instead of an 1.5 inches with my little 1/4 inch mark. So I'll do that on all 4 corners. So I'll come back when I'm ready to show you what to stitch next. Here I have the bottom of my pincushion already stitched. I folded all those edges and I stitched from the 1/4 inch mark all the way to the fold with a back stitch on each end. I went ahead and trimmed off the corners, and we are ready to set this aside for the large pincushion. Now for the wrist pincushion, I took my little piece that was double folded on the edges and top stitched, and I stitched it into a 1/4 inch seam, pressed it flat with the seam open, and now I'm going to center this over the bottom of my pincushion. I'm actually going to do it on the right side. I'm going to get it centered as best I can, and I'm going to top stitch it on this side as well as this side, and it will leave an opening right here for the elastic to go through to hold it to your wrist. So I'll go ahead and do that and come back. So here's the bottom of my little wrist pincushion with my casing stitched inside that I applied first. Then I went ahead and stitched my corners, beginning a 1/4 inch down and ending at the fold with a back stitch on both edges. Now I'm going to trim this to a 1/4 inch on all 4 corners. And after this is done, I have all my preparation for both my large and my wrist pincushion. So I can go ahead and set this aside with my flanges, and I'm going to hoop up some battleizer and get started on the stitching. So I'm at my machine, I'm ready to stitch the first step. And for the first step, you're going to use water-soluble thread in the needle, actually for step 1 and step 2. Today, I'm going to use a red so that it shows up on camera, but we highly recommend the water-soluble thread so that you can remove any stitching, unwanted stitching later on after your project's finished. So step 1 is to hoop battleizer, water-soluble thread in the needle, and it'll stitch a placement stitch. So let's get started with that. So here's our placement stitch. It's our background fabric, centering it over the placement stitch, and we'll continue with the water-soluble thread, and it's going to stitch a tack down and some more placement stitches. So this is my kind of off-white with gray background fabric. I'm going to center that over the placement stitches, and I just kind of peek underneath, make sure it's pretty well centered, smooth it out. Put it back on the machine. So here is my placement stitches. For step 3, we're going to place the applique fabric right side up, centering over the placement stitch, extending the bottom edge 1/2 of an inch. And on our instructions, we do have this little diagram to give you an idea where it goes. And I can tell by this diagram that it's going to go right here. So I'm going to place my fabric. I'm going to extend it a little bit there. I'm going to make sure that it's inside the center area, which will get a black applique later. Right side up. Put it back on the machine. And when you're actually doing it, you won't have to remove the hoop. I'm removing the hoop to show you where the stitching goes. So here's my very first Dresden blade already stitched. I'm going to do a little trimming. This part in here will get that black center applique. So I'm going to leave about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. This part here will be a seam for the next blade, so I'm again going to leave about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. This is my applique edge. So I'm going to trim this very close. I'm using my Hoop Scissors Mini. Trim it nice and close. And this is also a seam allowance on this side here. So we are ready to go ahead and place our next piece of fabric. Time to place the next piece of fabric. So I've selected my next piece of fabric. I'm going to place it right side down next to this Dresden. I can do a quick check and make sure it's going to clear everything. I could bring that down just a little bit. So I'll place it right sides together. I'm going to keep that cut raw edge even, put it back under the machine, and it's going to stitch a seam. I'm ready to stitch my seam. So you're going to want to make sure that you switch out your thread from water-soluble thread to a neutral thread. In my case, I'm using a red Orfill, and I will go ahead and stitch the seam. Very short seam, it knots at both ends. And then we flip the fabric right side up, smooth it out, and let it stitch the next step, which is a tack down. So there's our tack down. So now I'm going to go ahead and trim this very close, just like I did this one. I'll trim very close right here in this section here. This will leave 1/8 of an inch. This will leave 1/8 of an inch, and we'll continue doing that all the way around until we get to this last step. So I am on the last Dresden blade step, and I've got them all stitched and trimmed, and what I'm going to do is stitch this last one the same as the others into the quarter with the 1/4 inch seam. I'll flip it out just the same as the others. And I'm going to reposition the camera to give you a close-up of what to do next. I've stitched my last seam. I'm going to flip it up just like the others. And then I'm going to turn this back. And hopefully you can see right there the stitching from the first blade we did. I'm going to align the fold of the fabric pretty much at that stitching line, and then I'm going to take my little hoop scissors mini and stitch this off, or not stitch it off, trim it off, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam. So I now have a shape like this, and then I can just tuck this under and finger press it. Covering up that stitching. There will be some decorative stitching that goes over all of this, and it's wide, so if it's not perfect, it won't be a tragedy. So there we have it. So now I'm going to put it back under the machine needle, and I will let it stitch this curved section here and the section here. This will remain open, and I will trim that, and we'll come back and show you that. I've just switched out to my embroidery thread, my red embroidery thread, and the next step is to stitch some decorative stitching in between the blades, which will hold this open section down. So the next step is to applique over the center open area. So we'll place our, in my case I chose black, right over the center, and we'll go ahead and stitch that down. I went ahead and trimmed the center of the Dresden, and I'm going to keep with the same black thread and stitch the satin stitch around the middle. The center of the applique finished the satin stitch, so I've switched back to my red embroidery thread, and it will do a satin stitch around the entire outside of the Dresden. The next 4 steps are going to be applying the flanges. So if you remember, we have a folded edge and then we have a raw edge. So we're going to start at the top and work our way around, and you place your folded edge even with your water-soluble stitch line. And remember, mine is red so you can see it. So you'll place the folded edge even with that stitch line. And 2 important things. You want to make sure that these 2 ends do not stick out past your sides stitching lines with your water-soluble thread. That's very important, because After this is stitched and we turn it right side out, we want it to be able to flip up. And if it's sticking out past that, it will be stuck and you won't be able to do it. So this is how we place the first one, and actually how we place all of them. I don't have it under the needle of the machine right now. I thought the view would be better here. It's going to stitch a placement, or it's going to stitch a seam right here. And then we take our next one and we do the same thing. I went ahead and stitched the first seam. So the next flange will go on this side. Again, the folded edge will go along the water-soluble stitching line. That's just to help you line it up. And you'll keep it up. Make sure that it's not extended past your basting line right here. And also you can see just a little corner of it right there. Make sure you're not too far outside of the seam allowance. You want to be inside of it. So I'll keep this folded edge even. I'll place this under the machine and stitch this side. Our third flange will be along the bottom. Again, the folded edge will be along your basting line, keeping your ends from going past the outside basting line. So hopefully you can see that little corner right there. I'm good. And right here I'm good. So I will place this back under the machine and stitch this seam. The last side, the last flange, again the fold next to the basting line, staying within your seam allowance. So I can see a little corner of stitching here and a little corner of stitching there. So I will place this back on the machine and stitch the last seam. So all my flanges are now attached. I'm ready to go ahead and put the back on. So we're ready to do the back. So what you need to do is, if you remember this little red, or the red line I made before with the 1/4 inch mark, we're going to place that in the top right corner of your Dresden plate pincushion and turn your hand wheel by hand until your needle lowers exactly at that intersection. And it's going to do a little tacking stitch just to hold it exactly in the right place. So once you do that, it'll move down to the bottom and it will repeat that same step. And once we get those two places tacked in the right place, the next step will be the seam. So I'll come back and show you the tacks. So I've got my two little tacks in. So the next step is the seam. And now we'll go ahead and tack the rest of the sides and stitch the rest of the seams. I've unhooped my pincushion. I'm going to use the trimmer by George to trim all 4 sides, removing the battleizer from the seam allowance to reduce bulk. And because we made sure that our flange didn't extend past the corners when we were stitching it in the hoop, they're going to lay nice and flat. And we have an opening somewhere right here. We're going to now insert our foam. So this is my 1-inch thick piece of foam that's 5 by 5 roughly. It's a little bit choppy on the edges, but it'll do. If you do not have a piece of upholstery foam like this, and maybe you have some scraps of hoop shape, you can cut several layers of it. This is 6, which makes about 1 inch. If you don't have quite that much, do half that amount. The idea is that the bottom of your pincushion have a nice flat level surface instead of just stuffing it all with fiber fill and having it kind of rocky on the bottom. I like to put something more stable. So I'm going to take my piece of foam, fold it up, get it inside this little opening. Have to work it in there. Got it on the inside my opening. Got my corners where they belong. And now I'll take my fiber fill, and this will just make it look poofy on the top. And I'll stuff as much in there as I think looks good. Now we're going to go ahead and stitch the wrist pincushion. Step 2 is to take a little 2-inch square of hoop shape and place it within the placement stitch, and we're going to tack it down. Step 3 is to take a little square of background fabric and center it over the hoop shape. I'm going to keep with the water-soluble thread. Mine's red, so you can see it, but you'll use water-soluble. And we will do the placement stitch, or the tack down stitch. the little placement stitch for the Dresden applique, and this one is one little piece of fabric. So I'll place it over the middle, and stitch it again. Go ahead and trim around the outside edge of this and come back and finish it off. Finished my trimming. I've switched to a decorative embroidery thread in my needle, which is the red, and it will finish off the raw edges of the applique. Before it stitches off the raw edges of the applique, it's going to do a little decorative stitching in between the blades of the Dresden fan. And then the next step will be to finish off the raw edges of the applique. So the next step is to place this, your Dresden center, in this case mine's black, right over the middle. I'm going to change to a black embroidery thread, and it's going to stitch a circle, and I will go ahead and trim it and come back and show you that in a minute. Our next step is to switch to water-soluble thread. I am going to use black so that you can see it, and it's going to stitch a box, and this will be to help me line up my flanges, which is the step after this. There's the first one. The second one will do the same thing. Folded edge will go against the black, or in your case, the water-soluble stitching, making sure your ends do not extend past the end of the basting line. Continue around just like that. Now I've got all my flanges on, time to go ahead and put the back on. And this is my prepared back with the little piece on the inside that will be where the elastic goes. So I will place it right side down. I'm going to lower my needle exactly where that little red crosshair is, lowering it by hand. I'm just kind of straightening it out. Once I get it in place, pick up my needle, hit the start button, and it'll do that tack. We'll do the same thing at the bottom. We'll lower my needle exactly where that little crosshair is, making sure I keep everything else out of the way. Pick my needle up, hit the start button. And you, of course, will use a matching thread. I'm using black so that it shows up. So now I've got these two tacked. The next step is it will stitch a seam. So I'll just go ahead and let it do that because the fabric is held in place. So now it will do the other side. I'm just going to move everything so that it's not going to get caught. I will lower my needle exactly where that red little crosshair is. There we go. So I have it in position. I'll pick up the needle and let it stitch. And I'll just do that little tacking stitch. Now it'll come down to the other side. Repeat that same process, making sure nothing is going to get caught that shouldn't. Lower the needle right at that crosshair again. Let it stitch. So now that side seam is held in place, and I can tell I've got nothing caught that I shouldn't. So now just make sure it's all smooth and let it stitch the seam in between the two tacks. Now it's going to do the bottom. So I'm just going to carefully pick this up and turn, kind of turn the corner. Let it lay flat. And it should be in the right place, so we'll just let it tack. And it'll do this side as well. It should already be in the right place, so we'll let it tack. Now the seam. Now it's going to do the top, and the top will have an opening to turn it. But it should already be in the right place, so we'll just go ahead and let it tack. This side is also a tack. And it's done. So we'll take it out and turn it around and put it together. So here's my completely finished Dresden plate pincushion. I've got my clip flange on the sides, and I've got an awesome pincushion. So I love it. Can't wait to use it. I've gotten my little wrist pincushion to exactly the same spot where I've got my back on. This is the section for the casing, or it's a casing for the elastic to hold it onto my wrist. There's a little opening on one side, and you will need, it's hard to see it, a little piece of template plastic to insert in here. And it's going to go at the very bottom so that when you put pins in, it doesn't poke your wrist. So I'm going to insert that first, bend it a little bit. And get that right inside here. And make sure that it's nice in the corner. So it's this hard plastic right here. And then I will stuff this with some fiberfill. So I will get this all stuffed. I'm going to hand stitch the opening closed, and I will come back and show you how to put the elastic on. So here she is, isn't she cute? My little wrist pincushion with my clip flanges and my pincushion area. The plastic is on the bottom side, so when I poke a pin in, it won't poke through to my wrist. And this is my casing. So the last step is to take some elastic. You need 1 inch wide. I didn't have any, but I did have 1/4 inch. So I cut 4 strips of it. You can go 8 to 9 inches. And I zigzagged it together with a multiple step zigzag, and you can see it's still very stretchy. You can kind of see the spaces in between. And this is what I'm going to use for my wrist. So I kind of did a trial run to try it on, and I marked with a chalk where the size that I need it to be. And now that I know that, I can feed it into the casing. I'm going to overlap where those marks are, and I'm going to take it to my sewing machine. It's going to be a little tricky to get in there, but we can do this. So there you can see I've stitched my little box. My white line is pretty much in the center of my little rectangle here. So now I'm just going to trim off my tails. And then I will work this stitched area back into the casing. Cover it up. So there we go. There's my wrist pincushion. So we'll try it on. We have a nice fit. And we can take our little clips, put them here. I've got some pins. I can go all the way in and not poke myself. I love it. Great little accessory. I hope you enjoyed our video today on the 2 pincushions. Join me later on, and we're going to work on our mug rug. So talk to you soon. Bye-bye.